Hey there, Mike. Thanks for joining us here on the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are excited to hang out with another math moment maker, and you're actually not too far down the road, hanging out in Ohio. Mike, say hello, introduce yourself, and tell the math moment makers a little bit about you.
Yeah. All right. My name's Mike Lipnos, and I've been teaching mathematics probably for about 27 years at this point.
Nice.
I can remember I mostly taught at a middle school level, and I was moved to a curriculum office to work as like a lead teacher type thing. And I did that for about 6 months, and we kind of decided we needed a math coach.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss looked right at me and said, "You're the guy." And believe it or not, this was about 15 years ago. I was kind of bummed out about it because I was almost excited to move past math and into something else. But then lo and behold, my goodness gracious me, once someone says you're the math coach, there's a lot to learn and a lot to learn fast. And boy, has it changed everything in my life from that point forward. I never realized that there was so much more to mathematics than what I was doing in the classroom. So, and that's just, I was content coverage, boom, boom, boom. I do, you do, practice. We came from a nice, affluent community. Everyone was getting great outside audit scores. So, that was my math experience as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Then once I became a coach, I realized the difference is I have to understand how young people actually learn math. There's a big difference. And then that, of course, led me to what the topic, the agency topic today that I've really, truly grown into over the last 15 years that, if we want our young people to be mathematical, we can't expect them to show up at a building and be told what to do, when to do it, why to do it, and for them to have any kind of agency over themselves as a learner. It just seemed like such an oxymoron to me. So,
and maybe even seems maybe obvious now, but yet you, like us, we did it for so long without even recognizing it, right? You don't even think about it. You just like, this is how it's done. And then only when you kind of like get pulled into that other, role, that other place, do you all of a sudden sort of go, wait a second, what the heck's going on here? Like, what are we doing? Like, and what have I been doing over time?
And oftentimes it takes that shift, to be in the classroom, to, stepping outside of the classroom or in that supporting role where you do get that epiphany. I think all of us who listen, all of those who are listening to the podcast are like that. And if they're in classroom teachers still, it's probably the fact that they have been supporting others as a classroom teacher as well to, have that epiphany. I'm curious, Mike. We always ask this to every one of our podcast guests, and which is your math moments. When we think math class, think back to your time as a student. Something that kind of sticks with you all these years. I'm curious, when we say math class, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I as a younger student, I loved mathematics in math class up until I didn't. And that shift happened in 10th grade for me in geometry class. I was pretty good at learning procedures and backfilling and understanding why things worked, but when I got to geometry, that all left. And I can remember really having almost an identity crisis about it. Like I didn't know what I was going to do. I'm like, something's broken me. I don't know how to do math anymore. So when I went to college, I very purposefully, much like a lot of my elementary, friends and peers, I went to college seeking something that was not going to be high level math at all. And so, and I kind of forgot about those years. And then when I had that epiphany about content coverage versus, young people actually performing and doing mathematics, I was closing doors on young people, just like doors were getting closed on me for my future. And I don't want to do that for young people. So that's kind of what sticks out from my own mathematical experience is that math was awesome until it wasn't, and at that point, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn.
What you just shared, like you've kind of stated it in a different way. Like I always love hearing it from a different viewpoint, from a different perspective. We talk about, for me, it's like I call it when the wheels fell off the bus for me, or when you got kicked off the wagon, or any of those sort of like analogies. And that's a really interesting one as well. This idea that the doors were shut on you, and then that you were actually perpetuating that with students, just at like same way we were as well. And we did that because we didn't know what else to do, really, right? Like it was like that's just the way it is. And until you have that epiphany, you don't actually think of it any other way. And you don't even recognize that that's really what's happening. And you probably wouldn't consider it a door being shut on you until you have the epiphany, because you just assume it's like, well, I just wasn't a math person, right? Like that's the mindset that you're in. And that's what's being sort of modeled to you through your own experience. So I'm wondering, like, I want to dig a little bit deeper into your sort of shift from that, that district office job. You spent a little bit of time there. You said about 6 months, and then all of a sudden you became that coach. How long did it take you to have that epiphany? Like, was it like right away? Was it like through the attempts in coaching where like you were like, man, I'm not really getting anywhere here with some of the teachers? Or was it the fact that you're like, what the heck am I going to coach them on? They're all doing it the same way that I was doing it. And really, like for me, I always look back and I'm like, so why did some students still like my class when I was teaching in that way? And really the only thing I could kind of bring it back to is that, I built a good rapport with most students, not all, but with some students. And I'm going to guess that, that might be the same for you, might be the same for John. So where and when did that epiphany actually happen for you? I'm always super curious about that, because as we hear about people's epiphanies, the more times we share them in the various ways that they've happened for people, it gives us information and data for us to maybe try to recreate that experience for more educators, right? And like help them to shift those beliefs. So where would you say, like, was it right away? Was it 6 months after the role? Was it after grinding for a long time and wanting to quit? Like, tell us more about that. I'm always curious.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah. I mean, you go through all those emotions. I was 100% ill prepared to become a math coach. And I didn't realize that when they decided that's what I was going to do until I walked into a classroom and, it struck me as I saw a teacher pulling out workbook pages in chunks and stapling together. It goes, there's the next 9 weeks. Right. And in my mind, I was like, that doesn't seem right. Like that can't be the human side of learning. Like that just doesn't add up. And that was like the first like moment where I decided I needed to do something, because 10 years ago, I would have been the same person. I just wouldn't have ripped them out and stapled them. I would have had them printed off the copier in a stack in a shelf, and I would have pulled them out. But when I made those connections, and I would say I'm very blessed, because the district I worked for at that time, they sent me away to math recovery training. I got trained in Math Advantage, math recovery. Ohio State University used to have what was called MCP. It was a mathematics coaching program that was funded through a stipend from our state, or a scholarship or whatever. They're funded through our state. And that was fantastic. The people that I started like listening to and talking to, and they started reshaping what I believed mathematics was. And I think that's the big shift. You got to build this capacity to understand that school math and mathematics are two totally different things. And how do we make them the same? How do we make school mathematics be more mathematics and not just practicing arithmetic and computation? And that was probably where the shift started for me, was through those programs and those trainings. And it didn't happen overnight. I mean, that was a long time. I will say the moments that were the most impactful throughout that, and I always tell people today, once you see something, you're not going to be able to unsee it. So, for example, you see a young person invent or create a strategy for, subtraction with regrouping that we never would have been like, well, how are they going to do that if I don't tell them how? But then you see them do something and you're like, and when you start to see those moments and then they start to pile up on each other, you start to realize, wow, I think I've just been getting in the way of a lot of their natural thinking and actually been confusing kids. But you got to be open to think about those things. You can't you got to check your ego at the door, because let me tell you, I've changed so much of the way I think about learning in young people that, there's no room for a big ego there, because you have to reflect and change and just want to do what's best for them. You want to serve in the best way possible. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it was an exact moment. It was pieces piled up on top of each other that
Mm,
really got me there.
yeah, that makes sense. And I think you're right. Like, I think the best educators are the ones that have checked their ego at the door, and they have, pushed, it's about the I used to think of this too, was like, it was about the math. I'm here to serve math instead of, help students understand, and grapple with ideas and think about the kids. Like, I used to put the mathematics at the forefront as the only thing that really mattered, instead of understanding who kids actually were and the human element of them. And I think you have to check that at the door if you're going to be an effective teacher whose goal is to help students really understand the mathematics that they're doing, and for kids to come out of there feeling that they have that ability to do mathematics. I think once you check that, then that's when the real learning, I think, starts to happen for everyone. Like, not just the kids, but you as well. Mike, I think this is a good kind of move into, specifically talking about agency, because I think we are talking about, agency. You wanted to talk about it here as a pathway for higher achievement. You've been sharing your experiences already about, what's led you to focusing on that. I think your history, your memories, your experience has kind of steered you to this, thinking about students and ownership of mathematics. But what else, Mike, has kind of led you to making sure that, or focusing on that agency is the, the primary way that, in the pathway to higher mathematics?
Yeah, I think, without having collected millions and millions of data points and, ran some statistical analyses on it, um, my own experience, just in this position, I've probably worked, well, for the last 15 years, I've been a math coach, and I've worked in, hundreds of districts, worked with thousands of young people, spent times long-term in classrooms, spent short amount of times in classrooms. But the one thing that has stuck with me, especially in the classrooms that I spent a substantial amount of time in, is that you could sit in this classroom space where these young people look like they're grappling and struggling with content. Maybe it doesn't look like they're even getting to that mastery level of said content, but yet when I think about them and their outside audit scores, they outperform all the young people that were mastery learning along the way, and they had all the check marks. Yes, you did it. Yes, you did it. Yes, you did it. And these young people are outperforming. And I'm talking about young people that are on, IEPs, young people that maybe have come from different backgrounds, that maybe they don't have such a rich mathematical experience, as a young person. And the one thing that strikes me is that they're always coming from teachers' classrooms that are allowing them to be in charge of their learning. And what I mean by that is that it's not the procedural process on how to get to an answer. It's the study of the mathematical content within the context of a problem, and the conversations around that. So, it's not like, oh, we're going to keep, change, flip, right? We're going to have a context. We're going to see, what does it mean to divide a fraction by a fraction, or something like that. But it looks like the young people are struggling this whole time. And I often wonder myself, I'm like, are we doing it? Is this right? Like, do we need to pull in and like force some material down their throat so, they can answer the questions at the end of the year audit? And like, I've worked with teachers that are like, absolutely not. That's not where my heart's at. It's not what I believe is good for young people. We're not doing it. And they just stay the course. The mathematical practices come to life in their classrooms. They're not posters on the wall, right? The teachers aren't doing the mathematical practice. The young people are doing it, right? Um, and then those kids are outperforming peers that have been like the good students all their lives. And these quote unquote young people that maybe haven't had those same opportunities are outperforming them in outside audits. And it struck me very hard at the end of last year that the difference is that these young people have agency. They can sit down at an outside audit or a test, they could come across a math problem that they don't know the answer to, or even a procedure to get to that answer, but they're able to look at that problem and think about, what do I understand here? What do I know? What am I working with? What am I trying to do? They have that mathematical conversation with themselves.
I love it.
Basically, they perform the mathematical practices, and they might not know the content, but guess what? It's not stopping them from finding solution pathways.
That is really interesting and well said. I I tend to agree that ultimately what you're highlighting here is exactly what we're trying to work towards when, we talk about, and, there's some of the episodes way back when we actually just recorded with someone from the Math Moment Maker community about, and our suggestion for this individual was, kind of do what we call the real flipped classroom, like allow students to actually grapple with problems, like to productively struggle through this work and not leave them out to dry. Like, don't, we're not going to like leave them out to, if they don't figure it out, they'll never know. It's the fact that they're able to tackle unfamiliar situations, unfamiliar problems. And ultimately, like, I would argue that not only are you giving them the agency to do that, but you're also in the process allowing them to build confidence that they are capable mathematicians, that they are capable of finding solutions without being told. And to me, that is, you were talking about doors being shut, that, the way you were teaching, the way that John and I used to teach, were shutting doors on students, just like doors were shut on us. And in reality, it's like the exact opposite, that you're actually allowing students more opportunity to open that door and to realize how powerful the human brain is, given the fact that some of us have certain challenges that we have to overcome, right? Certain kids come to school with different experiences. Certain kids come with different learning disabilities. Certain kids come with all kinds of different things. But ultimately, the human brain is such a powerful tool. If we actually allow them to sharpen that tool consistently and repeatedly, that students can do pretty awesome things with it. So I want to ask you, when you see teachers who are doing this well, who are providing students with this agency, are you like, what sort of observations are you, witnessing in terms of, like, let's say even just student behavior, and really I kind of want to get to like this, how's their demeanor in the math classroom? Like, how's their beliefs and mindsets sort of, how is it impacting them? And I'm wondering as well, like, is it always, a positive outcome, or have you seen some teachers that maybe have struggled to try to, like, turn their classroom into this place where they do give students a little bit more of that responsibility and ownership?
No, for sure. I mean, I've seen all ends of the spectrum with it. I could say the classrooms that are super successful are the people that they have a vision and they have a belief system, and they're going to stay the course regardless um, of what the little events within a day or the day-to-day events have, because they know they have 180 some days to work through that. So first they have a vision and they kind of stick to it. The other thing I notice about them, super intentional, like very, very intentional about every conversation. I like to think every time we have a conversation with a young person, there's going to be a consequence there, right? Some kind of feeling is going to be
Hmm.
had. It's either going to be positive, negative, or neutral, right?
Right.
And I see that these teachers are always trying to make sure that that interaction is left positive. And I'm not saying it's a cheerleader always. It could be something where they're really struggling and they are not there yet. But the interaction with the teacher isn't about the deficiency. It's not from that point of view. It's from a point of view of, well, what can we do? What do you notice? What do you wonder? What can you do for this problem to make it feel easy for you, rather than a deficit model. So I see the intentionality of the teachers and the content they're putting up there. Making sure that the kiddos that aren't talking ever, they're the first ones they call on during a notice wonder. They're very
Hmm.
intentional with who they call on, when they call on them. Very intentional when they, quote unquote, I don't want to say lecture the group, but pull the group back and say, hey, gang, what are we here for? Where's the math? What are we listening to? Like, to get that classroom management piece. They're also very intentional that it's not all day long. It's only at the important moments where she or he knows they're going to get the full attention of the group. Teachers, I think, that struggle with it have a hard time giving up control. And when they see young people not producing correct answers, I think that stresses them out because historically we come from a content delivery model. And when we are doing content delivery, if young people in that space aren't understanding how to get to an answer, that's an us problem because we didn't deliver the content the right way. Right. So if that's what you're used to, now if you want to go towards student-centered, but you still see people not being able to get to that solution pathway or that outcome you want, then you think it's a failure. Whereas I look at that and I'm like, listen to the mathematics that's happening. They're actually talking about, numerators and denominators and their reasoning about their size. They're not just getting a procedure and getting an answer. There's more math in those incorrect answers than not. It's just hard for people to wrap their mind around that.
Yeah. Yeah. What do I always wonder about, like I call them look fors. I guess that's just, language that I've, had my whole teaching career from my administrators to kind of like think about what do we look for in the teachers that we support. And I guess what I'm thinking about right now, and I always wonder about is, and this is like a self look for. Let's say I'm in the classroom right now, and it's like, what are some of those like telltale signs that you think, that a teacher says or a teacher move is doing that if I'm listening right now, it's like, if I've seen those, words or phrases or teacher moves, that's one of those telltales or those look fors to go, wait a minute, like we could go down a different pathway than going down this pathway. Like it's a trigger for us to be like, let's take a step back. Wait a minute, if I go do this routine in my classroom, is it allowing my students more agency around their learning or less? Like what in your opinion, like what are some of those moves or things we should look for? Because, if I'm listening right now and sometimes we resort back to some of those moves and we're like, wait a minute, let me take that step back. But if I'm working with teachers or I'm next door to a teacher and I'm hearing that, or I pop in and I'm seeing it, what am I looking for to be like, you know what, maybe I should just have give them a quick tip that seems so, not confrontational, but what are the things that we look for to kind of make us take a step back and rethink?
Yeah, I think my big one is whenever I hear someone say, well, let me show you, and I hear that a lot, walking through halls and classrooms is, well, I'm going to show you, I want to show you. And that's a big one for me when I start to hear that in classrooms. Let me show you how to do this. I was thinking of another one when you were asking. It's kind of slipped my mind at the moment, but anytime that I'm in a space and we're more worried about what the outcome to the problem is rather than talking about the problem itself or what your thinking may be to get started on the problem. When I'm in classrooms and someone throws a problem up right away and they start talking about solution or like share how you solve this right away without talking about the actual problem, like that's a red flag for me. I'm like, well, we should study the problem just as much as we study our solutions. Like we have to understand what's being asked of us. How are we going to model something if we don't understand it? How are we going to do any mathematical modeling or put a context to it or, quantify it? Those are all things that strike me. If I don't hear a little bit of confusion, if I don't hear young people talking to one another, I don't know if you're familiar with complex instruction. I'm sure you are. I really like the idea of, equalizing classroom status. Like if we're building agency, every person has a seat at that table and every person matters and every thought matters. And we have to be really super intentional about it. As a coach, when I walk into classroom spaces, like if I'm going in to teach in someone's room to model something, a lot of times I'll get pulled aside before I walk in and say, this is my low group, and it's like everyone wants to give me that disclaimer before I walk in there because they're afraid I'm going to evaluate and judge the work they're
Right.
doing. So far from the truth. And the other thing I hear a ton of when I leave classrooms is, I don't know how my kids knew that. I never showed them or I never taught them, you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
And those things just stick with me. I think that we get into, even myself, and I do this a lot, and I try to stop myself, but you can try to be student-centered and the most conceptual math teacher in the world, but you can still scaffold and probe kids in a univocal way that's getting them to think the way you're thinking about it. You
Right.
know, by asking the I call it a univocal pathway. I'm asking questions that are leading you to think like I do.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot of that. And I don't necessarily know that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's a transition thing. I think, when you go from content delivery to trying to student centered to ask more questions, I think that's also something that happens naturally.
Well,
I
just wanted to throw this in there too, because I think it can be really helpful in some cases, and it can be really maybe, hurtful is maybe the wrong word, but maybe like too much if we
Yeah.
always do it, right? So like you were saying, like, I think there's times where, if let's say, I think in a perfect world, if we could allow students to freely share, and not be sort of funneled from the start, but
Hmm.
then as they're sharing, it's like, how can we take what they're doing and then also kind of help at least mold the conversation just a little bit without them knowing, right? So like that's the tricky part, is like you don't want it to, you don't want it to be like where kids are like identifying as like, sir's just gonna eventually lead us to the thing we need to do
Yeah.
anyways. So why do I even want to think about it? But I think something that you're modeling in what you're sharing here on this conversation is that it really it really comes down to us as facilitators of the mathematics learning being very reflective and being very intentional about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So,
Yeah.
if we're questioning and we're thinking about that ahead of time, is like, how am I going to question, right? So like that the anticipatory stage to go, is that going to be too direct to where I need them to get to at the end? Because that's the other piece too, is like if there's no thought about it and I don't think about the questions, I might end up we might end up over here, and it might be a very hard way to get all the way back over to here to the learning goal of the
Yeah.
day. But it really comes down to being reflective in what it is that we're doing in the classroom and sort of using that as data to guide, where we go next. And it
Yeah.
gives me, you've the pieces, John and I are in a document here, just kind of jotting down some of the little pieces here. Some of your look fors, or the things that sort of, pop out to you, are really interesting to me. And I'm picturing them in my own experiences, and you've articulated them so clearly. So I guess my question for you then is, let's say, when you've sort of assessed, and we're not evaluating, very different, like when you've
Mhm.
assessed the scenario that maybe the teacher is maybe not allowing for enough opportunity for students to be, in charge of their learning and taking that responsibility, what might be like a starting point? Like, that there's some people listening that are either in coaching roles or leadership roles of some type, or it might be the teacher themselves that, what you just said, they might be going like, uh-oh, like that's me. Like
Yeah.
I'm that person, and I didn't even realize it. But now Mike is sort of highlighting that for me. What can I do about it? Like what's like a, we'll say, like, not a massive leap first start, but like something small that they might be able to kind of, think about, plan on, and then try to add to their, repertoire. So they're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or, panicking that they're doing it all wrong, but rather that they make this small tweak to sort of head in that right direction.
Yeah, that's a good question, Kyle. I honestly, I like to say first off that there's no wrong. There's only ways that we can reach young people better. So there's really no wrong way, right?
Sure.
There's ways that are more natural to the young person's way of thinking anyway. That research has shown us how they learn. One of the first things that I would recommend for folks to do is, when someone in the classroom has a question, they, hey, Mr. Lipnos, I'm wondering about this. Instead of me answering it, just throw it back to the young people in the space, like, hey, Susie has a question about this. Who can answer it? Or turn and talk with your talk partner for 20 seconds. Can someone come up with a solution for that? Instead of making me the expert in the room, we're working on this together. I'm Dan Finkel said it in his TED Talk. I'm not the answer key, and I think that's, I mean, we can tell young people, like, lip service is a big thing in education. We can tell young people all the time, I'm not the answer key. Answers aren't important. It's the process, or persevere. But if we then say those things and we turn around and run our math class like we always have, then it's just lip service. It doesn't mean anything. Totally. But if I truly believe those types of things, and I believe that I'm not the expert in the room, but we're in this together, then the questions are for the class. They're not for Mr. Lipnos, So I think that's a really, really good starting point, is just to say, you know what? I'm not answering any more questions. I'm going to let us as a class answer them, talk about them, and come to a consensus of understanding together.
Yeah. Good.
And that's a community building that builds agency. All of those little things. Remember, every single conversation matters, and it's going to leave feeling somehow, some way,
Totally.
So I love to have every single day a turn and talk partner. I'd like to make it different every day. If it was my classroom, I can't mess teachers' classrooms up like that, but here's your turn and talk partner for the day. Every time I want you to turn and talk, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, no longer than 30 seconds. None of this like 4-minute conversation stuff.
Doesn't last.
No, because you and I right now, if you said, hey, let's talk about this, we'd get about 30 seconds in and we start talking about ice fishing and hockey and football, right? That's what the young people do. So they're no different than us.
Totally.
So that's one thing that I do. An article, I don't know who wrote it. It was an article that was a blog post through NCTM years ago, but it was kind of rethinking the gradual release model.
Okay. Yep.
Right. And it's just basically instead of we do, or I do, we do, you do, just flip it, just go in reverse order. And that's easy enough to do because I'm not asking anyone to change anything besides the order at which they present material. Get young people to have some skin in the game before you start your instruction,
Yeah. We call that the real flip classroom,
Yeah.
You do it the other way, which is not, the flip classroom about, watching videos or anything, but flipping the order that you would typically, structure your lesson. Mike, what would you say would be the, if you could leave one big idea with the audience today after this call, what would you say that one big idea is?
Standards for mathematical practice. I mean, I think the standards for mathematical, how in the Common Core, the language arts have their anchor standards. I almost wish our standards for mathematical practice had more of a role in our standards. So teachers, instead of getting a list of content things to check off the list, I did that, I did that. What if every teacher in every school knew that their goal was every single day to get my kids to behave mathematically? And, that's a wonderful what if, but
totally.
Those, if the young people are actually doing the mathematical practices, then we're differentiating, we're building agency, we're building positive math identities. And I truly, firmly believe, after everything I've seen over the last 20 some years, answers will come. If we truly study mathematics and play with mathematics the way it's meant to be, the content answers will come. And if they don't come naturally, it sure will be a heck of a lot easier to teach them because we have young people that are primed and ready to go.
I love it. I love it. That's such a great takeaway. A couple big takeaways, I think, there. And, we often say it's like, looking at and trying to reframe the content standards as more of like ideas on how to engage in the mathematical practices. Like they're ideas. It's not like that's not the reason we're doing the content standards. It's like it's giving you ideas on how you can engage in the practices. So let's not get too bent out of shape over every student walking out of the room being a master of completing the square or whatever, and more about like, wow, completing the square is like a really interesting thing, like let's explore it, and like let's actually try to figure this thing out, right? And I think you're 100% correct. Students who are given these opportunities to think, to problem solve, where they have agency, where they are thinking mathematically, as you've articulated, they are building true problem solving skills, which, like, let's be honest, the last time I used quadratic formula was when I was teaching a class about the quadratic formula. And then before that was when I learned the quadratic formula. Like that was that is not what it's really about. It's really about learning how to think. It's really about learning how to conjecture, how to reason, how to prove, how to do all of these things. And, I think this episode was a great opportunity for the Math Moment Maker community to kind of hear some of the messaging that, we hear across over 250 episodes that we've done, but coming at it from a different angle, a different perspective, and using some different language, which I think is really important. And ultimately, what it really comes back to for me as my big takeaway is that, like, good teaching is good teaching. And when we do those things, and when we're giving students the opportunity to do the thinking, we are engaging them in good teaching and learning practices. So, Mike, I want to thank you a ton for joining us on the show here today. But before we go, folks who are intrigued by some of what you've shared, where can they get in touch with you? Where can they learn more about you? Or maybe they just want to get connected with you so that they can, continue to learn alongside you in their math network.
Yeah, so they can reach me at my Twitter handle is #mlipnos, or is it at mlipnos? At mlipnos, right? And then my email is Mike Lipnos, LIPNOS .com, or kidscan, KIDSCAN. So kidscan @gmail.com.
Awesome.
I love it.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for being here, Mike. And we'll put all that in the show notes, and we'll look forward to seeing you at, say, maybe a conference coming up, or maybe next year. But you're not too far from us, so let's make sure we try to kind of meet up and keep this chat going.
Yeah, and I would say, John, maybe a summit session on the horizon for 2024 in November. So put that on your roadmap of ideas, because I think a lot of what you've shared here could really would be well received by those who attend the virtual summit each year. So definitely stay in touch for that, and hopefully we'll be networking with you sometime soon.
I hope so, and I want to thank you both for all you do for our community. It's fantastic.
Oh, thanks so much, Mike. Take care.
Thanks, Mike.
We appreciate you.
Have a good one.